friends, and welcome to T. Thomas Fortune Cultural Center. My name is Gilda Rogers, and I'm the interim chair of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to Reimagining the Police. We have a great lineup of panelists for you this evening to engage into some real important discussion. And to get this started, I want to introduce you to the moderator for this evening, whose name is Candace Kelly. She's a Renaissance woman. Candace is a broadcast journalist. Candace is a professor of communication law at Rowan University. Candace is an entrepreneur. She's the founder of Curl Prep Hair Solutions that's sold in Whole Foods. And she's a playwright. And she's my friend. And we've been sister friends for like 25 years, and I'm so proud that she could be here because she's also part of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation as a board member. So, Candace, I'd like to bring you to the podium now.
Thank you, Gilda. So good to be here at the T. Thomas Fortune. Thank you very much.
Yay!
Yay! I appreciate that. And hopefully you will all continue to join us as we have a series of social activism panelists and conversations. Today we're going to get right into it because we all know what's going on in terms of recently in Philadelphia, the shooting of Walter Wallace, and it's bringing up the questions that we have heard for so many years, and that is, what do we do with the police? What is the reimagining of it? Some of you may be thinking, all right, why don't we defund it? So that's why tonight we have an esteemed panel of guests to talk about this issue. I am joined on my left by Quovella Spruill. She's the police director of the Franklin Township Police Department in Somerset. To her left is Dr. Walter Greason. He's the Dean Emeritus of Monmouth University. And to his left, Sergeant Kaan Williams of the Neptune Township Police. And at the end, Reverend Nicole. Always good to have a Reverend on hand. She's with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She's also a community activist, and she has been on the ground protesting. So thank you all for being with us today. All the questions that I asked you today, as I told you before, jump in. People want to know what is going on with the police, and I know that you have the answers. And I also want to ask our Facebook friends to make sure that you send questions as we will funnel them to our panel here. I first want to start off with you, Quovella. What do you think the situation is in terms of the police and what's going on with them in terms of what needs to be changed? You've been on the ground, you help in the training of police officers too. What are they doing wrong, if I can put it that way? Especially when we talk about what's going on in Philadelphia and so many other situations.
So a lot of what happens in police training is that the police are being trained as the warrior and no longer the guardian. We were taught to protect and serve, and somewhere along where there's a war, the war on crime, the war on drugs, those words being used, it sets the tone for training. It sets the tone for police work. When you go out, we want guardians. We want people who want to relate to citizens, who want to communicate, who want to understand what's going on, and are able to interpret situations versus react first. So, in policing, you're taught to control the situation. And sometimes in the training that I do, I tell the officers, it's okay for things to be quiet. It's okay to listen to residents. You don't have to come on a scene and immediately sit down, be quiet, shut up, move away, and bark out orders, because sometimes you have to digest exactly what is going on in the situation. So we want to change that tone to, guardians versus warriors. We are not warriors, we are guardians. We're there to protect the citizens and help them, because I want my children, I want our community to realize that that is the role of police. I don't want my children, I don't want my son to be afraid of police officers.
Sergeant Kaan, I wanted to talk to you. In terms of just being on the ground, I know that you are from Asbury Park, and you said that that's helped quite a bit to be a part of the community. And before we get into this whole reimagining, I just want to hear from you about what you think it takes to make sure that there isn't this automatic barking when police come on the scene, because you have de-escalated, and we've talked about having a history with the city that you are from, and then policing there. What is your takeaway from the approach?
I think the biggest issue is that as police officers, we are taught a certain way of policing, and we get into this habit of demanding respect that we're not giving out. Like she said, we bark orders to people, and we demand that they respect us when sometimes we do not respect their wishes as well. I try to take the approach of, for the 12 hours that I'm on a shift, me and the 12 guys that I supervise, we are there to serve you. But regardless of what you need, regardless of the situation that we come in contact with, we are there as a service to you. Even if we have to place somebody under arrest for an unfortunate circumstance, we are there to serve that person who is under arrest, which means if only thing you have left is your dignity, we are going to make sure you keep that. We are not there to, it's not a me versus you thing. And I think you accomplish a lot of that by hiring individuals who are from the community. And when I say that, it's because I'm from Neptune, actually, Neptune Township, which is right next to Asbury Park. The fact that I live there and I still do everything there when I'm off duty, I can't treat people like I don't care about them, because they will see me when I'm off duty. They will see my son. They will see my mother, my sister, my family, and they know who we are. So the fact that I know the community that I serve, I know the people who work in certain stores, I know the problem areas, and I know the good areas, and I treat them both the same. I think that comes a lot into having the respect, because you were born and raised there and you want to see the community do better as a whole.
Yeah, when we talk about the police and the history of police out in Greason, we know that in terms of the police state and what it represents just historically, it comes from slave catching, it comes from the hierarchy that was built during that time. What are your thoughts about kind of the vestiges that have been left behind in terms of the police state that exists now and how it began?
That's the hardest thing. When we have really compassionate professionals as we have here at the table who demonstrate that they want to connect to community, grounded in community, that deeper concept of where the abuses come from in terms of the ideas behind the training, the ideology of even the word police, that it is about control and authority and the way that states can license someone to apply violence against the citizens to direct them to a lawful end. All of those core assumptions come out of people who have property wanting to protect those against those who don't have property. And as the 19th century unfolded, the number one purpose, before there was ever a professional police force, was to organize local vigilante authority to control enslaved populations. And then as these populations and immigrants come into larger cities, that's the origin of official, professional police forces to control undesirables, people whose recreation was too loud, people who might get out of control and get into a bar fight or weren't considered the upstanding citizens in these places. Most notably Chicago and New York and San Francisco. Those places were all teeming with new people figuring out how to live the lives and achieve their American dreams. And the police were there to kind of keep the folks who already had wealth, who owned the banks, who owned the factories, to keep those people in line. The Pinkerton agencies that went around and were strike breakers, that just kept people from striking for more wages. These were all the practices and policies that ultimately took form in what we see as A. Mitchell Palmer raids in 1920. And that process basically entrenched what becomes the FBI. And standardizes a federal system of saying there are people who are inherently criminal and will never be full citizens, that must be kept underfoot with force and thrown away and locked away from the general population whenever possible. We have to uproot all of that past and reimagine this idea of a guardian or a community servant at the heart of what I don't even really think we should call it a police force. I think there are ways we can change that later. I think we can call them our community guardians. There are all kinds of terms that I think should actually grow out of the local community's feedback that talk about a way that these people, these professionals, serve the common good and promote community healing. And I think that's where we can start to go tonight.
Reverend Harris, I want to get into this whole idea of why we're here, and that is Reimagining the Police. You have served on many organizations as well as hit the ground running in terms of protests. You are kind of, you're at the level where the people are. Talk to me about what you are hearing people want the police force to actually look like. Because when we talk about reimagining the police and changes that happen, we often go to the community. What are they saying?
I think they want the police department to look more like a reflection of what the community looks like. So if you have a community that is made up of a certain demographics and then the police department looks nothing like that, and then now it feels like somebody's commuting to work to police me and then going back home. And so they don't want a police department that doesn't look like their community, one. Also, they don't want to continue to be pushed to the margins. To Dr. Greason's point, where policing was about protecting the property owners, right? It's still very much about, it seems to be very much about that to those who are on the margins, right? So what I realize is that as policing as we have gotten to this point, what's happening is that in a lot of communities that are being gentrified, right, you have newer residents that are coming in, and then the police are now protecting the property owners, the newer residents, and the people who have lived there a long time who are not property owners are being pushed more to the margins. They become those who become criminalized, and while the newer residents are being the ones that are protected and privileged. And so they don't want to feel like they are the outsiders in their own neighborhoods and in their own homes. And so because the police are there, they're there to protect all of us, why is it just seems like some people are policed one way and then we are policed another way?
Sergeant Kaan, what do you say to that?
I say I agree. I've seen it, and it's no stab on anybody who does hiring or promotions in our department, but I've seen a lot of police officers get hired to Neptune that do not live there, have no idea what it entails to be from Neptune, and the problem exists is where they do not understand the culture of the people that they serve. And I say that because if you go on a certain call and you are policing a certain demographic, let's just be real, one demographic might talk different than another one does.
Right, the cultural norms are different.
Correct. The cultural norms are completely 100% different. And if you have not experienced that in your life, your first time as a 21-year-old young police officer from a totally different town, maybe a totally different state, you might react to that in a way that somebody who was used to that would. And I think that is some of the problem why the use of force is not done correctly, because the communication is there and they're not understanding the communication and interpreting it the same way that the people are giving it out.
So what training do police officers get when it comes to cultural norms, mental health, things of that nature? I will start with you. What do they know?
So can I just make one comment? Because I am in charge of hiring and selecting people for promotion. So I agree with you're saying, and preference should be given to individuals who live in their area so that they know the people. But I also can say this: I am not from Somerset County. I am not from Middlesex County. I'm not from Franklin. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. But I transplanted myself there in Franklin for the last 6 months. I know how to talk to people. I know how to deal with the community. So, I hate to say this, it wasn't a training thing. It was how I was raised. It was how I was educated. It was my parents. It was my background. It was my mentors. It was my upbringing. So I think the problem becomes in not just picking people from the area, which is always a bonus. It's written into our ordinance that they get preferential treatment over hiring and promotional selection when there's ties or, it's built in. But those people, how we hire needs to be evaluated. What are we looking for? We're always looking for the strongest, the fastest, the certain stature. Look at the state police. I mean, they all look like the same. They all look like the militia. You put on that uniform, you really don't know who's who. It's almost like us now wearing our masks. So the selection process needs to be done. I can take Sergeant Kaan to Franklin, and he would do great. So, because that is the person he is. So who are we looking for in these positions? Who are we training? So the training that is given, I can say, needs to be revamped. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually on a committee with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and other law enforcement and prosecutors, where we are presenting to the Attorney General new methods of training. They should be trained, officers and campus. They need communication. We spend 40, 60, 80 hours at the range, doing defensive tactics, learning how to handcuff people, remember that? Okay. But how much training did you receive on sitting down, communicating, and learning someone's culture? You did not. If you were an executive and you took a job in China, what would they do to you? They would make you go on practice.
That's right.
Immediately.
Let me open this up to the floor. I do want to talk briefly about this thing of welcome bombs, because it looks like so many other things, so many other situations and shootings, except that we do have the mental health component there. What could have been done differently? And this also plays into, well, let's reimagine the police. If there was somebody who dealt with mental health issues or social issues, or who could have been there? Why did they not have tasers? There's so many questions around that. I wanted to just open up the floor to talk about what could have been done differently in that situation that's still on fire in Philadelphia. I'll start with you.
And I think, I don't know the training, so I think we want to pound on the training part of it. But what I see is that not seeing the full humanity of people. I mean, they shot him, I believe it said 13 times. I'm like, would you shoot a grizzly bear 13 times? Like, why would you shoot anybody 13 times? So it's like, I don't know what training is in place to help people to overcome that, where they're not seeing the person as, I don't know, as subhuman. Like, you don't see them fully, you don't see their full humanity. You don't. Because if you can shoot somebody 13 times, I don't see how you see them as a human.
So this is really important for me. So my cousin was a captain of the police force in Ashford Park. My uncle retired from the Borough police force. My father worked his entire life in corrections. And so I was around law enforcement in the training and the process of how people manage folks who need help and can't necessarily go through life without presenting a threat to themselves or to others. I get that. And I just came from a use of force training briefing by the police in Borough. And what struck me was the situation where someone was running away, preventing someone from escaping. How escape is trained as a form of resistance. That's actively resisting is attempting to escape. And the general public doesn't understand that. They see someone running away as surrender, as compliance, as something and it's not read that way, it's not trained that way, at least in the briefing that I just got. And at the same scale, I think the bigger one that's blown up the last 6 months is this misreading of passive resistance. That when you don't give up your hands and immediately comply in a physical way for folks who are looking to arrest and say, we're going to diffuse the situation, take control. There's this other piece of managing passive resistance that's literally taught as a social justice strategy for how do people raise their voice in protest, is to stand and shout and say, I am waiting to be taken away and arrested. But then that is then a cue for the way the training is done under the AG's guidelines to then say, well, you're not complying, even though your resistance is passive. And there's just a gap there in the way that the officers see the situation and the way that the public is attempting to communicate. And that provokes these massive outbursts that we see across the country, where the people see the same videos, see the same things happening, but are seeing it in 2 entirely different ways. And that's the piece we need to work on. We need to find a way of reconciling the training so it's not a use of force situation to deal with passive resistance or with public protest. That has to be revised so that and I'm glad to hear the piece that you're talking with the AG about, because New Jersey is a place we can really make that progress. We can have that conversation that helps people raise their voice against injustice and places the officers in a role to support them and protect them and help their voice change the situation that they're upset about.
Sergeant Kaan, so let's go to Neptune Township Police. Let's take away half your budget. Let's give it to other people. Let's give it to social services. Let's give it to people who can help with mental health. How does that sound to you?
It depends. I really would have to look at how it was written out and how these monies are being distributed. I hear when people make the argument that they should be, that's all you hear. But you don't hear why they're doing it or what the purpose of it is. Now, as far as having social workers ride with police officers, okay, or giving some of that money to social networks that would help in situations like the one in Philadelphia. There are still going to be situations where the police are going to have to come and use some type of force, regardless if they have a social worker with them or not. There are still going to be situations where somebody just does not want to talk to anybody, and there's still going to be out of control people that we have to deal with. Now, if you take some of the money away from the police officers that's already there, that's even less training. So that means that these situations, you're going to have police officers that are even less trained than they are now. And I understand that they want to put somebody who is well-versed in that. However, there are still going to be instances where police officers have to respond and they're going to have to use force. So I understand the argument. I will not sit here and negate the fact that a lot of money is spent on police and it doesn't go in the right place sometimes. However, at first glance or hearing it first, to me, it does not seem like it has been thought out thoroughly enough or all the way through. Only because we don't get enough training now as it is. And I don't think people understand the magnitude and the pressure that is put on a police officer to do many different jobs, okay?
And what are the many different jobs? You get on a scene, and then what goes through your head in terms of what you have to process?
Well, let's take it a step back from just getting on that scene. Let's say if he worked a 12-hour shift, he might have answered a call, a first aid call. He might have answered an alarm. He might have answered a call where a mother wants us to discipline their child. We answer all types of calls that we're not equipped to handle. Nobody taught us how to discipline somebody else's child. We just do it to the best of our ability. There's no book that's given to us that says, do this way. So then after 7 calls of things that we really don't want to answer in the first place, then you come to a call where now you have to make a split decision whether you use physical force against somebody or not. So it's very difficult. And there are plenty of calls that we defunding us. There's a lot of police officers that don't want to do certain tasks that you guys, I'm not going to say you guys, that the community expects us to do. 911 is basically like a call for service for anything. My neighbor stole my garbage can. Call 911. You understand? So after all of that, then we have to come deal with the stuff that now, instead of worrying about being a guardian, now we're a warrior now. So it's difficult.
For the simplicity of the taser, right?
Okay.
And everyone should have a taser, right? How do you leave? I thought that you, as a police officer, you are next. Had to have all of those things. That you had your gun, you had your taser, you had certain things. How in Philadelphia was there no taser?
So on the back of that's the defunding question.
Yes.
And then you say every officer should have a taser. So to get body cams and tasers for a department of, I have approximately 60 patrol officers. I received a quote of, it's so ridiculous, I think I blanked it out, but it was over $1 million. Somewhere between $1.7 million to $3 million. The 60 police officers. And that was not every officer having a taser. That was having about 12 tasers in the department that they would rotate per shift, because the max we would have is about 12 officers out at one time. So they're not cheap. They're not cheap. Millions and millions of dollars for body cams and tasers. So when you ask why didn't they have it, because of funding. And if the funding is not available and you reduce and you defund the police, what goes to the side? Gadgets and tools outside of weapons. Training, mandatory training. You can't send officers to do scenario-based training, facts training, which is firearm simulation training when they learn to shoot or not shoot or do something else, so that trainers and commanders can see how officers really act during situations, because those things cost money. It's money.
Reverend Harris, I think you want to jump in.
I kind of want to pose a question. I don't know if I'm understanding that question, but one,
I want to ask about the things that you cannot train a person for. So, my first degree is in education, right? And my second is in divinity, and so I'm a pastor now, but I was a teacher first. It took me 1 year to realize I could not teach middle school. I literally did it for 1 year, okay? And was like, this is not for me. And I do think that there are some things, and I could be wrong, but I do think there are some things that maybe are outside of training. I should not be a police officer, me, personally. I'm too shaky of a person. I'm too jumpy of a person. It's not a vocation that I should even consider. So if somebody becomes a police officer and you realize, you know what, this is not for you, how they should go. And so, and I want to know what that process looks like. And when you bring it up, I always hear the union get brought up, okay? So I really want to know what that looks like, because I truly believe that you can't, and excuse my language, you can't train somebody not to be a punk. I'm sorry.
So,
but
and that has to come out. That has to come out within 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
So you have supervisors, you have chiefs and directors up against the clock for 12 months. And you know, and I know sometimes that does not happen in 12 months, because you have to put someone in a situation and pray it's not a deadly situation before you can get rid of them. Within 12 months, you can make that call to terminate someone on probation, but it doesn't always surface them. So that's why there should be continued licensing. There should be some type of accountability for police officers to undergo constant monitoring. When you, after 5 years, you're able to get promoted. They have to undergo another psychological exam, another physical exam, to see if you're prepared to leave.
But there are no cultural exams. Are there any exams that have to do with mental capacity of people?
No.
Okay, so how do we change that? And you talked before about some things that are emotional.
So there's a really huge piece that we often don't talk about in public policy here, is that all of the police forces are essentially local. That's what we're talking about, Newark versus Franklin, or Neptune. Asbury Park probably has some deal where they overlap, but they could be county bodies. It's not just the sheriff's office, and you wouldn't have every town scraping to pull together funds to equip and support their local law enforcement body.
So they're kind of like Candace
And so, yes, they merged this out and made this, and that's a very interesting model to look at. But even beyond that, I've seen these examples, and it's largely in metropolitan areas, like places where they have a metro, big cities, surrounding suburbs, shared law enforcement responsibility, where they're buying helicopters and anti-tank weapons and extensive SWAT paraphernalia, and just massive millions and millions of dollars bought on subsidy from the U.S. military in many cases that doesn't actually serve the needs of those communities. And it's millions and millions of dollars that could go towards building out county-level social services for social workers. Not necessarily for ride-alongs, but to be on call and to be able to respond when the police say, we need you here. And so for the police to buy in and connect with the social workers and with educators is the biggest thing. If they're connecting to superintendents and principals and dealing with families as people who are extensions of their own community with love, that body of social workers, educators, and police together, organized at a county level, will deal with almost all of what we're talking about at a lower price point. And again, New Jersey could be a leader on this immediately.
And Camden County, New Jersey, was taken over by Camden County in terms of policing, and they saw a big reduction in their crime when they used their resources differently. What do you think about that model?
I think it works in certain places. Camden was a place where it worked. I'm not sure it would work in every county.
And why is that?
Let me start with Somerset County. The demographics, the size, Franklin by itself is almost 50 square miles. So I couldn't see and we also police other local municipalities right now, so which spreads us out. So I could not, I think because of the size in Somerset County, same thing for Newark, they're very busy. If you develop the Essex County Police Department, you probably would have about, well, I know you're going to have, because there's 3,000 cops there. So you have the police department the size of 3,000. So I don't know if that would make services better or worse for citizens. So I think it depends on the county, it depends on the demographics, it depends on the size.
Can I jump in there? The reason why Camden County worked, its statistics went down. They had one of the worst statistic rates of murder and things like that for years. When they got rid of their entire police department, they hired back 50% of the people who they got rid of. The reason why it worked was because they adopted a community-oriented based policing model where the chief made every patrolman walk a beat and knock on doors.
Meet people.
Yes,
Get to
and
know
meet
people.
people, get to know people. So, and ask them, how can we serve you? You know, we are here to serve you. What can we do to, you know, to basically make your life better? It wasn't just about them dismantling the entire police department because they hired most of the guys back. It was that they adopted a new form of policing, which I think can be done without firing people, which can be done without getting rid of entire police departments. Now, there are plenty of politicians and people that are trying to go to a countywide police force, even in some states and some towns in New Jersey, which it could work, but then you have to realize you're going to have 50 chiefs in every department that's going to, they're not going to like that. Correct, you know, so, and I can understand their argument with that. So I think you can accomplish that goal by just changing the way you utilize your law enforcement, your police officers, by going from a us versus them mentality and being out there or on the beat and being sort of like a beat cop like they used to have.
Can I go back to something? So we talk about police being called to certain calls where we should not be. Mental health, social services. A couple things happen. Mental health is out of control in our society. Drug abuse is out of control in our society. And a lot of what the police deal with stems from that, but the burden becomes on the police department. Citizens call 911 for that help. And we all know drug abuse and mental health, solutions to those are voluntary. Mental health is a serious issue in our society. There's a stigma with that. I think more attention should be dealt with on the health end of it, where our society addresses it and gives resources to that so that people know you can get help. You know, you don't have to do certain things. You don't have to live this way. You don't have to fight your demons by yourself. People need help. That is.
So, Sergeant Kaan, when you go on a call and someone does need mental assistance, there's never a conversation of, let me give you this help with this mental health resources as I leave, or is that not your responsibility?
There is. I mean, there are resources that we have that we can utilize, but for the most part, it's just a crisis evaluation. So for the most part, it seems that our goal is to get into the hospital as fast as you can and have them evaluated by somebody from the hospital. Now, I mean, it depends on the officer as to how long it takes to talk to the person, and see what their problem is. But we have to realize that most of the time, it's not the person who's suffering from a mental episode who's calling us. It's somebody else. So when we get there, we already understand that we are not in a position to diagnose this person. So we will call somebody, a screener out to come see if this person needs to go to the hospital. So we know we're not capable of making that determination on our own. And majority of the time they'll go to the hospital just by, our words of persuasion, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they
Or
won't.
they come right back. The hospitals release them,
Yes.
and then they're right back. And we all know if they don't have the right type of insurance, they're going to go sooner than later.
So, yes.
So, because my thought with the defund the police, I looked at it as reallocating funds to departments that needed them, and so I had an experience once when I was at the hospital with a family member, and there were 3 police officers there with a young lady who, I'm from Asbury Park. She everybody knows that she has these episodes all the time, and it was 3 police officers in there with her at the hospital, and I kept thinking to myself, couldn't that time be better spent? I mean, like they're gonna sit in here with her. Now, this is just me thinking, because, and I'm like, well, if she had the services she needed, wouldn't that help them to not have to sit in here with her for hours? You know, so I think, you know, sometimes the language is strong of defunding. What I look at it really is reallocating it to other services that are ultimately going to help the police, because then you can do your job rather than doing that.
Right.
So I don't know if that's, I don't know. I think that's how I'm looking at it. And then also I want to quote one of the community organizers in Asbury Park. We're presently dealing with the issue of there was a young man who was killed by a police officer in Asbury Park. And so we've been talking in our city about reform that we need there. And one thing that Jennifer Lewinsky, community organizer, said at a recent demonstration we had is that police officers don't need to show up at the scariest moments in our lives with guns pointed at us. So if somebody's already dealing with anxiety, 3 people pointing a gun at them is not helping the situation. But I understand that, you know, they might have been trained and you have to protect yourself or whatever the case may be. But isn't there a different way to deal with this situation? I would want a mental health staff person on the police department that could have showed up and dealt with that situation differently, because watching the video of Hassani's murder was me watching somebody with a mental health crisis with guns pointed at him.
Right, right. For those people who are just joining us, just so that you know who we are joined by, I'm joined by Quovella Spruill, Police Director of the Franklin Township Police Department, Dr. Walter Greason, Dean Emeritus of Monmouth University, Sergeant Kaan Williams of Neptune Township Police, and you just heard from Reverend Paul Harris, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. What about on the federal level? We've been talking about policing and local communities. Then we talk about what might take place on a county level. But federally, there are some laws, especially after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Federally, couldn't we just take care of this with one congressional act? And what would that look like? On the books, we were talking about, I think, the Criminal Justice Act of 2020 and the no-knock warrants, getting rid of them, making sure that we can get the history of police officers and you know, what their history has been with the community. Federal level, what do you think about that?
So, the issue with the no-knock warrant, and I always go back to Breonna Taylor that was all built on a lie. That was not the purpose of no-knock warrants. The no-knock warrants came out of, you know, officers being able to knock and force entry, like, you know, for their safety, for destruction of drugs or evidence and that type of thing. So that whole situation was built on a lie that the officers told, and that was criminal. The reasons why you would need a no-knock warrant, I mean, here for us anyway, when I worked in Essex County, was so strict that, you know, judges often said, no, you can't have a no-knock warrant. So it starts from the top with the judicial laws and rules as to why they issue that. Do they still need them? Maybe, but they should be very stringent and very strict as to why you would get a no-knock warrant. I mean, is it life or death if someone's flushing drugs down the toilet? No.
Right. So federally, Sergeant Kaan, I mean, if there were some laws, it's kind of like the mask. If there was just a national effort to say, wear the mask, maybe something would happen. Federally, if there was a national effort to say, this is the law, so you don't all have to decide on your own, community by community, that would be helpful.
I think it would. However, situations like that usually get left up to the states because nobody wants to touch it, because they wouldn't have necessarily the backing of the millions of law enforcement officers that are walking around in this country. As far as you did speak on no-knock warrants, if you're creative enough, I worked narcotics for 6 years in Neptune, and I was on loans to DEA for 2.5 of them. If you're creative enough, you can find ways to safely enter somebody's home without, first of all, smashing their door down. They have their purposes, absolutely, but however, if you think this guy is dangerous, if you've done your research and you've done a good investigation, you know where he's going, you know what his whereabouts are, so you can pick an opportunity to stop him when he's outside of his house. And you can ask him who's inside your house, and you can walk him back in the house in handcuffs and utilize a key to get in the door. Situations like that are reasons why judges are a little nervous to sign for no-knock warrants now, because there is a lot of uncertainty if the research isn't done the correct way. So can federal legislation be done which prohibits officers from doing certain things? Of course there can, but there already are. It's not gonna stop every single bad thing from happening, because you know what, police officers, they do make mistakes, and if we're held accountable for the mistakes that we make, maybe it will give a little bit of ease to the situation. However, I think you're still gonna have some of the same outcomes.
Yeah, you're a different type of police officer, Sergeant. I gotta say that. People probably watching this on Facebook like, we need a few more Sergeant Kaans in our neighborhood. You know, Reverend Harris, you just mentioned working with Asbury, I believe, right? What would you tell our Facebook watchers who are writing a lot of questions about training? Some are saying more training, some are saying less training. In working with the local community, what are you doing in order to make change?
Okay. So right now, the community is being very vocal about what they want. And so we're coming together to say, these are our desires and these are our demands. So in Asbury Park, the community wants a civilian review board. They want funds reallocated to mental health services. I actually had a resident call me up and say, I remember there was a time when we had like a counselor or something that would show up. What happened to that? I don't know, but I'll try to find out, you know. So they want that. Also, they're concerned about what happened with the recent killing, because, and I don't know if it was a year ago or maybe a little over a year ago, there was a report that came out by the Star Legend that when they did research on every department, every you know, yeah, thank you, the use of force, and the officer that killed Hassani was the second highest number of complaints in the city. So now you have residents going, okay, you knew he had an issue and you still let him police us. So now they're saying, you know, what do you do with this kind of data to make sure that we're safe? And so that's the things that the community wants. I think the community, people absolutely want safe policing, absolutely.
Right.
But they want policies in place that don't protect police more than they protect them. And so now we have to look at policy. We've got to look at putting a review board in place, because you know, policing themselves doesn't sit well with the people.
Right. And when we talk about reimagining the police, you've given some wonderful ways that you've come to the table to try to make change. Dr. Greason, what do you think are other ways that people can actually, who are watching, if they want to make change, make their voices be heard, to actually see change in their local police departments? What do they do? What can they do?
So there are two pieces that come immediately to mind. Folks who are local committed activists have to learn the language of how people are hired and trained, promoted, evaluated within the law enforcement structures, and understanding at the bottom of it, the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey sets the structure within which all that operates. Now, the Attorney General of New Jersey operates within the context of the Federal Department of Justice, that then, depending on who is in the White House and who is the Attorney General of the U.S., it's going to be very different. You know, Eric Holder is not Bill Barr, and so there's just fundamental distinctions about how they go about this. You don't get that use of force report from the Star Ledger without the time that Holder had served as the AG. He put that in place for everybody across the country. That's not the priority. Like, we reversed that over the last 4 years. And so, beyond knowing the way the structure works, there was something that struck me earlier at the use of force piece in Field Borough, was a legal case that came in the early 1980s that was basically hinged on the word apprehension. Apprehension. And this is a very technical word in law enforcement, an enormously important word that you can't get through and become an officer. You can't be a professional without understanding the way apprehension works. But for the average citizen, it sounds like just a big word, right? But it's not just literally being taken into custody. So that I was stunned when I saw this in use of force guidelines, is for police officers shouting, "Stop!" is to cause apprehension, is to cause people to stop and look around and wonder what's going to happen next. In the same exact way, them unholstering and pointing a firearm is to cause apprehension. It's not a use of physical force. It's not a threat of deadly force, but it is just a symbol to cause everybody to react with apprehension. And that's a huge distinction about how folks are trained versus how folks receive or expect the interaction to unfold. And so within that, I come to one final thing that's really huge for me when you talk about Asbury Park. In my second book, Suburban Erasure, I talk about the Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital. And Marlboro Psychiatric Hospital was an enormous institution.
A lot of people know that. All right, let's break it down.
So this was a state institution funded for those who were struggling with addiction, struggling with mental illness. There was an entire staff of nurses and social workers. Both of my parents worked there in the 80s. And this was the heart of the black middle class in a lot of ways for Western Monmouth County. So if you got a job at Marlboro, you could all of a sudden afford a house. Right? You could give a little bit more money back to your church, and your Sunday school did a little bit better. Your kids got a chance to go on to a better high school, better college. And so Marlboro was an enormously important institution in this region, and it was shut down. They laid everybody off in the mid to late 90s, and at that exact moment, they deinstitutionalized. You can go back into the state archives. They deinstitutionalized all the folks who had addiction, mental illness issues, and they basically moved them to Asbury Park.
Wow.
And it just shattered that community for the better part of 2 decades. And so that's the kind of thing that we look and we see the consequence. And we're like, well, no, if you take 500 people that are struggling to keep themselves functional, and you say, yeah, all y'all go here and just hang out. And it's worse in Asbury Park because they actually ship people from as far away as New York and from Philadelphia. We're doing the same thing as what happened after Marlboro closed.
Right. So it's an expected outcome when you look at it that way. And so when we talk, Sergeant Kaan, about changes, systemic changes in Neptune, what are your discussions?
As far as in the police department?
Yeah, in terms of how do we get a different result than what we are seeing on TV or in neighborhoods that are right next to us? What are you doing in terms of preventive measures? Are there discussions?
There are discussions that I'm only on one level. Okay, I do not have that seat at the table as of yet for implementing a discussion that.
How do we get you a seat?
I will get there. I'm working on it.
People are talking about him on Facebook.
So
He's a staple in the community.
I appreciate it.
That's
Thank
great.
you. I can only do so much, so I focus on myself, and I focus on the 10 to 12 guys that I supervise. And I just try to instill in them the belief that I have of being a police officer in my own town that I was born and raised in. Now, to some of them, it may sound cliche, they may not buy into it, but a large majority of them I feel as if it does resonate. I feel as if out of the supervisors that we have, I'm the person that they call, whether it's for something that they did that was a little bit, in the gray area, or whether it's something that they want to tell me that they did that they actually enjoyed doing. But as far as our township is concerned, they are installing it's not a review board, but they're reorganizing the structure in which who comes up with the rules and policies for the police department. That is in the works. I believe it's coming out in January. However, I can't sit here and honestly tell you what the top brass has in mind for conversations like this. I can only do what I do on a level where my shift is, and hopefully moving up in the ranks and moving up in different positions will allow me to reach more people in my police department.
Quovella, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement.
Yeah.
What are they doing in order to move some things to the next level in terms of training or looking at and reorchestrating the police? I'm sure that they're doing something.
So it was funny when you said what could he do to get a seat at the table.
Yes.
I was going to say join Noble. and that is not just a plug for Noble. It is true because, you know, on the state level, on the national level. So I am the executive vice president of the New Jersey chapter for Noble. And as part of that, like I said, we are in conversations with the Attorney General's office about hiring, about training, about continued training and licensing for police officers.
And how's that going?
It's going well. I mean, listen.
Could we see change?
I believe it's going to take a while. It's not going to be one of those things within, you know, within 3 months because it is cultural. It is going to take a while, and you have to have people that look like the community at the table. And in most counties, that is not the case. And, you know, I've said to the prosecutors, maybe look at the county prosecutors, there's not a lot of diversity there.
Right, and they're the ones who determine whether a charge sticks or not.
Well,
they can make recommendations
and not
otherwise.
just that, they are the chief law enforcement officer of the county. Like the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state. So I think Governor Murphy made a big change when he appointed Attorney General Gruel.
Yes.
I mean, he looks totally different than anyone ever as the Attorney General. So I think that was a start, but it needs to happen. It needs to trickle down. And on a national level, I'm also National Financial Secretary for the National Noble. And guess what? We're doing the same thing. We're involved in voting. We're involved in trying to get more funding from DOJ and from the Bureau of Justice because, as you mentioned, when Holder, Loretta Lynch were in charge, guess what? There was funding for training. They did send us to collaborate with Arkansas, with Los Angeles, with Baltimore to talk about the issues and to help make changes around the nation. And they were interested in New Jersey. I don't say this just because we're from New Jersey. I think we're in New Jersey for a reason. New Jersey is not perfect, and I'm not saying that. And I've been on panels and I said we're not Alabama either. And people say, well, we're not far away. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. On paper, yes, we are. And in my involvement, what I've seen being at the table, I'm not moving my family, my children to Alabama right now. Not right now. And or Florida for that matter. But I'm saying that to say we are leaders in a lot of things because they say no chokehold. We didn't have chokeholds. Were you taught chokeholds? No. That does not exist in New Jersey. That is not a technique. And you would be going before a grand jury if you put someone in a chokehold and they died. So there are things in New Jersey. We are leaders.
And who's to say there'd be a charge? I mean, the grand jury is a whole other topic. Let's be real.
I've been there.
Yeah, you've been there.
I've been there.
Right.
And that's difficult in itself.
It is.
So before we close, I just want to put this out to anyone who wants to answer this question, or two, or three. What do you think is going on with George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor that was the tipping point? Because we can go back decades to Abner Lima, and so many countless others, to the Ahmaud Arbery, to the George. There's so many. I'm just curious, what do you think is going on in the atmosphere right now that made this a real tipping point? George Floyd,
That was blatant. I mean, black,
but
white.
so many other things.
But that was, the whole thing was on video. So think about the other situations that happened. People could justify it, not normal people, but some people sat around and said, well, you know, the cops had to do this. It was on video. It was live for the world to see. No one could deny that was murder. Everyone had to say, well, yes, that was murder. And I think it opened up like a sore, you know, for the nation that like enough is enough. Like now we're gonna do this and you're gonna do it in our face and you're gonna do it on video, regardless of how many body cams and cameras you knew were there, you didn't care. It was just blatant, and I think it just rose to a level where citizens had enough. And when we had protests in our community, I said to them, this helps us too, because people like us, it helps us make it known to the community and to the lawmakers and to our governments that the citizens are not happy with what's going on, and we know what's going on, what needs to be done. You know what? Force a change.
Before our final thoughts, Reverend Harris, we've talked and you said that when Trayvon Martin was killed, that left you
Just sitting in your chair for 3 hours.
Talk to me just about that being a tipping point for you and where we are today.
So that was a moment for me where kind of everything changed. I remember feeling that came over my body with that verdict. So let me say this. So I attend many demonstrations and protests, and I try to get a seat at the table where change can actually happen. With George Floyd, right, I was out there in Asbury Park demonstrating for George Floyd, but I could not help but think as I was out there, and I want justice for George Floyd, but I was thinking to myself, this feels a little bit hypocritical because I know the issues in Asbury Park. I know the people in Asbury Park who would have been abused by police, killed by police. Like, we're out here for George Floyd, but James Manzo got killed here. Like, that happened here. And I think that I want us to all look within, as Officer Kaan said, he looks at himself, right? It's easy. It's the whole plank inspect. I'm a preacher, so the plank in your eye, the speck in their eye thing. Like, you're pointing all the way over there and going, see, that George Floyd thing happened. But now we've got to look within at our own local departments and what's going on here. I really do believe that everybody, because I'm working on it in 2 states now. I'm working on police reform in New Jersey and in New York, because my church is in New York. And I'm realizing that governors and stuff like that, they're like giving directives that they want police reform to happen. You need to take a look at your own department, right? So I don't want what's happening right now to be like a knee-jerk reaction to George Floyd, because police reform probably needed to happen in your local department way before George Floyd.
Right.
So take a look within, because if we don't do this correctly, it's just going to stay the same. And I don't want that to happen. It's hard to tear anything down, especially from its foundation. And from the foundation, the history of how policing even came to be in this country is tainted right from the foundation.
Right.
So if we're going to address it, we're going to have to be in this for the long haul, period. And so I think for me, George Floyd, it was a straw for a lot of people. But for some of us, seeing him was us. Some of us went through post-traumatic stress disorder ourselves. That's what that was for some of us. Some people thought we were mad about George Floyd. No, I was mad about my cousin that got beat up last year. I was mad about when I got pulled over by the police officer, and I was scared. Right. So us seeing George Floyd we were having our own reactions to that from our personal experiences. And so I think timing also played into it, because we were in a pandemic and people had time to sit home and watch the video over and over again. Right. So there was a whole lot of things that played into why it's happening right now. But I want us to take this moment and do the hard work of looking at our own local departments. Don't keep pointing your finger to every other department and every other state. No, look within, because you have some stuff going on.
And I was going to end on that. What is your advice? You would say, look within, get to the table, and do something, because you can do that. Is it as simple as going to your local police and say, hey, how can I be a part of change? Or what would you say someone was watching?
I would say find those that are in the fight already.
Okay.
You see a good fight, get in it.
Okay. Right?
Yeah, because there's somebody that's doing the work, most likely, so get in it. I've learned some things here tonight that I'm like, oh, okay. Now I understand a little bit better. So continue to educate yourself on policies, on how things operate, and don't let's not talk about yourself. Let's get this stuff.
Starting time. Your advice for folks in terms of, let's take a look at Reimagining The Police. How does that happen? I know you're doing it with you said you had 12 people you oversee. What else? Someone's watching. What can they do to see that you and the 12 and other people in your department can change?
I would just say you have to be able to hold yourself accountable before you try to hold somebody else accountable. It's some of these things, some of these issues are only going to be changed if the person or persons are willing to change. And if you're not willing to change your attitude or your biases towards certain things, then it's not going to change. Whether a policy tells you have to act a certain way or not, it's not going to change. So I would say to actually get some type of change, everybody has to look at every situation on a different. Look at this issue and don't let it play into your ideas about this issue. Be your own person and hold yourself accountable so that you can feel okay when you try to hold somebody else accountable for what they do.
Dr. Greason, what's your advice for someone watching who wants to get involved to make change?
My goodness, there's so much, and so take a small step is the first thing. But take one thing where you look at a website or a video, learn something that you haven't seen before, connect to the people that you've seen on the panel tonight. But I really want to point at what's happening in Monmouth County, and it's so hard for me because I see what our county commissioners and our prosecutor's office and our sheriff's office have done. They just built a new multi-million-dollar facility right around the corner from where I grew up. And the money goes into this kind of massive expansion of our law enforcement infrastructure, but it doesn't go into the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here tonight. And the cost of it is not necessarily just what happens on the streets of Asbury Park at the public housing project and the protests. It's also what happens because we're not paying attention to the militias in New Jersey. We're not paying attention to the white nationalist organizations. The guy I went to school with built a multinational white nationalist network in Ocean County and was never held accountable, escaped to Russia. There are militias that operate within just blocks of where I live now. But there's no attention to shutting them down and making them held accountable for the threat they are to people like me and my family. And so that's my closing point, is that pay attention to the real threat. Pay attention and marshal a united community to stand up against the people who mean to harm us all.
Well, people want to see change. They have their own imaginations running about what police forces could look like. What do you tell them in terms of how you can work with them and they can work with you?
I say show up, get involved in community activities, go to your local council meetings, learn the issues, learn what is going on around you, because guess what? Those local elections affect you much quicker than the national ones. Yes, we have to vote every election, but you need to know what the issues are all the time, not just when there's an uprising or when there's a protest. You need to stay involved. And that is what happens when we get lulled asleep and we're not watching. That is why we get the president that we have now, because no one was watching what was going on. Everyone just assumed, oh, it'll be okay. No, as soon as you turn 18, you can vote, you have to vote. I have my 14-year-old, she's a November baby. She's like, I can vote before I turn 18. I read that. So she's already looking forward to vote. You have to vote, and young people have to realize your vote does count. It does matter. It really does.
All right. Quovella Spruill, Police Director of Franklin Township Police Department, Somerset. Dr. Walter Greason, Dean Emeritus of Monmouth University. Sergeant Kaan Williams, Neptune Township Police. And Reverend Nicole Harris, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. I want to thank you so much for being with us today and sharing such amazing insight. I hope that people who are watching will reach out to you. That's why I said your name several times. Reach out to them, Google them, and be in contact with them, because they're not just sharing their ideas here. They want to continue the conversation outside of here. And we also want to continue the conversation with you here at the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation and Center, where we have, by the way, a wonderful exhibit of Count Basie, the kid from Red Bank, downstairs. We really want to check that out. And we also ask for your support financially with donations in order to keep conversations like this going, as well as other exhibits and social activist work that we are doing. Thank you so much for joining us. Continue to post your questions, because they'll get you back. All right, thank you. All right.
I just like to say that we had a lot of comments that came through Facebook. So I want to reiterate what Candace has said to people like Jennifer Lewinsky, Jocelyn Graham, who asked great questions and had great comments, Brigitte Mondesir, So please, this is just the beginning of these conversations. We will be engaging in this topic of discussion and trying to find solutions and answers to move this forward, to make reform and change in this country. So I'm saying to all of you Facebook fans and people out there, please stay in touch. Please stay connected to us at T. Thomas Sports and Cultural Center, and look forward to the next session. And please, again, reach out to the panelists here tonight, and connect with them so that we can come together and make change. Thank you so much.